One evening, after 15 years of building an empire under his wing, my wife stood in our penthouse and confessed, "I've been in love with your mentor for years. We're finally going to be together." She expected me to break, but she didn't realize I was the one who had already opened the door for the person standing right behind her. Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here for this new story. After 15 years of marriage and a career defined by loyalty, my wife, Lyra, didn't greet me with her usual elegance. On a Tuesday night in our glass-walled living room, she sat across from me, not as my partner, but as a stranger, and told me she had been having an affair with Corvin Hale, the man I called my mentor, for nearly 5 years. She waited for me to shatter. She waited for the predictable man she thought she knew to beg or shout. But I didn't say a word. I didn't even flinch. I simply checked my watch, nodded quietly, and waited for the elevator chime. In that exact moment, she had no idea that the world she and Corvin had built on my back was already being liquidated. Thank you truly for joining me today. Before we dive into how this all unfolded, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements for storytelling and educational purposes. While any resemblance to specific names or firms is coincidental, the lessons about power and perception are very real. There are moments in a career and a marriage that divide your existence into a before and an after. Mine arrived on a Tuesday in the city, while the lights of the financial district blurred outside our floor-to-ceiling windows and everything still looked like the picture of ultimate success. I'm sitting in a much smaller, much quieter office now, long after the markets have closed, with a scotch I haven't touched in an hour, thinking about the look on her face when she realized who was really in control. Corvin Hale didn't just build a firm, he built a religion, and for 15 years, I was his most devoted acolyte. He was the man who taught me that the market doesn't have a pulse, only patterns. I remember the early years, the late-night sessions in his mahogany-clad office where the air always smelled of expensive tobacco and the weight of unchecked ambition. He would lean back, his silver hair catching the light like a halo, and tell me that the greatest assets aren't found on a balance sheet, they are found in the vulnerabilities of other men. I believed him. I watched him move through the financial world like a predator in a silk suit, and I modeled my own silence after his. Then there was Lyra. When we married, I thought I was bringing her into my world, but looking back, I realize I was merely presenting her as a trophy to my king. The realization didn't come all at once. It was a slow-motion car crash that began 3 years ago at the Solstice Gala. It was the kind of event where the champagne is vintage and the smiles are surgically precise. I remember the exact moment the air in the room shifted. I was discussing a merger near the balcony when I looked across the ballroom. Lyra was standing with Corvin. She was an interior designer by trade, a woman who understood the golden ratio and the power of a well-placed shadow, but that night, she was looking at Corvin with a gaze that had nothing to do with aesthetics. It wasn't just a look of admiration, it was a look of recognition. Corvin was speaking, his hand resting casually on the small of her back, a gesture of ownership he usually reserved for his favorite protégés. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the heat of his presence, her eyes bright with a hunger I hadn't seen in our own home for a long time. I watched as Corvin leaned down, whispering something that made her laugh, a low, intimate sound that bypassed me entirely. In the world of investment, we call it a red flag, a signal that the underlying value of an asset is being compromised. That night, as I watched my mentor and my wife silhouetted against the velvet curtains, I realized the man who had taught me how to spot a lie was currently telling me the biggest one of my life. I didn't confront them. I didn't cause a scene. I simply stood there, sipping my drink, and began the cold, methodical process of auditing the life I thought we had built. I had spent 15 years learning how Corvin Hale operated. It was time to see if the student had finally surpassed the master. The suspicion didn't remain a ghost for long. In the world of high finance, every ghost eventually leaves a footprint in the form of a ledger. 6 months after the gala, I began the quiet, clinical process of auditing my own life. I didn't use my firm's resources. Corvin had ears in every department. Instead, I worked from a burner laptop in a nondescript coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, peeling back the layers of our perfect joint portfolio. That was when I found it, Hale and Rowe Holdings, Hussey. The name was a twisted irony, a blend of my mentor and my wife, registered in Delaware and hidden beneath 4 tiers of subsidiary companies. On the surface, it looked like a standard real estate vehicle, but as I followed the routing numbers, a more sinister architecture emerged. Corvin had been funneling millions in consulting fees from the firm's offshore accounts directly into this entity. And Lyra, my elegant, perceptive Lyra, was the one signing the wire transfers. As an investment strategist, I had spent my career identifying market manipulations, but I had never seen a hedge as sophisticated as my own marriage. Every romantic weekend away, every renovation project Lyra took on, every business retreat Corvin invited us to, it wasn't about love or loyalty. It was a curated distraction. While I was focused on the front-facing growth of Hale's empire, they were using my name and my legal standing to bridge the gap between Corvin's illegal kickbacks and the legitimate economy. The betrayal was structural. Corvin didn't just want my wife. He wanted a silent, unsuspecting partner who would carry the liability if the federal authorities ever looked too closely. Lyra didn't just want Corvin's power, she wanted the thrill of the game they were playing behind my back. I remember sitting in that coffee shop, the screen reflecting in my glasses, realizing that I was the poison pill in their plan. They had spent years making me the face of their most aggressive trades, ensuring that when the music finally stopped, the chair would be pulled out from under me, not them. They expected me to be the loyal soldier who took the fall for the general and the queen. I closed the laptop and looked out at the rain-slicked streets. For 15 years, Corvin had taught me to never let an opponent know you're in the room until the trap is already sprung. As I walked back toward our penthouse, I realized I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. If they wanted me to be the strategist for their empire, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would build a paper trail so deep and so precise that by the time they realized I was no longer on their side, there wouldn't be enough left of their world to bury. In my line of work, we often say that numbers have no ego, but they do have a sense of humor. As I sat in the dim glow of my home office, the house silent around me, I stopped looking at Lyra's business through the lens of a husband and started looking at it through the lens of an auditor. Her firm, Lyra Rowe Interiors, was a triumph of soft lighting, high-end textiles, and bespoke experiences. But when I bypassed the glossy marketing decks and accessed the raw accounting software, the elegance vanished. The discrepancy was tucked into the minutiae of a renovation project for one of Corvin's coastal estates. I scrolled through digital invoices for Italian marble that cost 3 times the market rate and custom cabinetry from a workshop in Switzerland that, according to my research, didn't actually exist. It was a classic over-invoicing scheme, simple, ancient, and devastatingly effective. Corvin would pay the inflated bill from one of his corporate accounts, Lyra would take her fee, and the surplus would be funneled back into the Hale and Rowe holdings we had discovered earlier. I watched the cursor blink against a line item for a $20,000 chandelier that had supposedly been installed in a guest wing I knew was currently a shell of drywall and dust. This wasn't just a side hustle for Lyra. It was the engine room of Corvin's money laundering operation. She wasn't just his lover, she was his CFO of the shadows. Every time she had come home late, smelling of expensive lilies and talking about the emotional resonance of a room's layout, she had likely just finished balancing a ledger of kickbacks. The betrayal stung, but the clinical precision of it was almost impressive. They had used her talent for creating beautiful facades to build a literal wall of fake expenses between Corvin's crimes and the light of day. I began to export the files, one by one, to an encrypted drive. I mapped the flow of every dollar, tracing the path from Corvin's offshore entities to Lyra's boutique firm, and finally into the private accounts they intended to use for their life together. They thought they were building a nest egg. I knew they were building a cage. As I watched the progress bar reach 100%, I realized that Lyra's biggest mistake wasn't the affair. It was her assumption that because I didn't talk much, I wasn't listening to the story her bank statements were telling. I closed the ledger and leaned back, the silence of the penthouse no longer feeling empty, but heavy with the weight of the evidence I now held in the palm of my hand. The transition from husband to hunter required a level of performance I hadn't known I possessed. Every morning, I adjusted my tie in the mirror, checked the coldness in my eyes, and drove to the firm to play the part of the loyal protégé. Corvin was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, yet he was blinded by his own narcissism. He saw my quietness as submission, and my diligence as a sign that I was still safely under his thumb. We spent long nights in his private suite, the city lights shimmering below us like a sea of fallen stars. Corvin would pour 2 glasses of 20-year-old scotch and lean over a mahogany desk cluttered with acquisition targets. "You have the gift, Bastien," he'd say, his voice thick with the practiced warmth of a father figure. "Most men play the market, we design it." I would nod, mirroring his smile, while my thumb pressed against the encrypted drive in my pocket. I was designing something too, but it wasn't a merger. When he would leave the room to take a call, likely from my wife, I moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. I had bypassed the firm's internal security weeks ago, creating a ghost administrator profile that left no digital footprint. I watched the progress bars crawl across the screen, harvesting the raw data of his insider trades, the offshore routing numbers, and the communications that linked his personal greed to the destruction of entire pension funds. The most dangerous part of the architecture wasn't the data, however. It was the human element. I began meeting a whistleblower named Marcus, a former compliance officer Corvin had ruined years ago, in the back booths of dimly lit diners on the edge of the city. Marcus was a man hollowed out by the industry, but his memory was a steel trap. He provided the context the numbers couldn't, the verbal agreements, the handshakes in backrooms, and the specific dates Corvin had manipulated the SEC filings. "He'll kill your career if he finds out," Marcus warned me one rainy Tuesday, his hands shaking as he pushed a folder of internal memos across the table. "He already killed the man who was worried about a career," I replied. Back at the office, Corvin would pat my shoulder, praising my unwavering focus. He had no idea that every time I agreed with his strategy or thanked him for his mentorship, I was mentally checking off another box on his indictment. I was no longer his student, I was his auditor. And the cost of his lessons was about to become more expensive than even a mogul like Corvin Hale could afford to pay. The table was set with the kind of precision that usually precedes an execution. It was our anniversary, but Corvin had dropped by with a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, an intrusion that Lyra met with a flush of performative surprise. As we sat in the glow of the crystal chandelier, the air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and the unspoken language of a 5-year betrayal. I watched them. For 15 years, I had analyzed market signals, the slight hesitation in a trader's voice, the fractional shift in a stock's momentum, but tonight, the data was purely human. Lyra reached for her wine glass, her fingers grazing the stem in a way that mirrored the rhythm of Corvin's tapping pen on the table. It was a rhythmic code, a silent confirmation that they were still in sync, still operating a world that excluded me. "To loyalty," Corvin said, raising his glass. His eyes met mine, steady and patronizing. "The rarest commodity in our industry, Bastien. And the most expensive." "To loyalty," I repeated, the word tasting like copper. Across from me, Lyra smiled, the disarmingly honest smile she used when she was lying the most effectively. She began talking about a new project, a sprawling estate she was designing for one of Corvin's silent partners. She spoke of textures and light, but I heard the structural reality. Another shell, another layer of drywall to hide the movement of capital. As she spoke, she adjusted her napkin, a sharp, deliberate movement. Corvin responded by leaning back and checking his watch. They were communicating in the shorthand of a long-term partnership, checking the temperature of the room, confirming that the predictable husband was still safely sedated by the routine. They looked at me and saw a man who was part of the furniture, a reliable asset that didn't require maintenance. They felt safe. They felt untouchable in the sanctuary of my own dining room. What they didn't see was the phone in my pocket, silently recording the dinner's audio, or the fact that I had already redirected the very funds Lyra was subtly referencing into an escrow account controlled by the authorities. Every time Corvin laughed, I saw the digital footprint of his last insider trade. Every time Lyra looked at him with that quiet hunger, I saw the fraudulent invoices she had signed that morning. The dinner was a masterpiece of theater. As I cut into my steak, I realized this was the final act of their security. They were dining on the edge of a cliff, toasted by the man who had already cut the ropes. I let the conversation drift over me like white noise, focusing instead on the cold, beautiful clarity of the math. Tomorrow, the before would end. Tonight, I simply smiled back and poured my mentor another glass of his own hubris. The office was colder than usual on Wednesday morning, the air conditioning humming with a mechanical indifference that matched my own. Corvin was already there, standing by the window of his corner suite, looking out at the city he believed he owned. He didn't turn around when I entered. Instead, he gestured toward a leather folder resting on his desk, a heavy, silent presence that felt like a predator waiting to strike. "Bastien, we've reached a crossroads with the Sterling merger," he said, his voice dropping into that paternal, conspiratorial tone he used when he was about to ask for a sacrifice. "The regulatory environment is shifting. I need a steady hand to take the lead on the final compliance filings. Someone I can trust implicitly." I walked over and opened the folder. It was a poison pill in the most literal sense. The document was a strategic realignment of executive responsibility, a dense thicket of legalese that effectively transferred all fiduciary liability for the merger's unforeseen losses directly to my desk. If the deal collapsed under the weight of the insider trading I knew he'd baked into it, I wouldn't just be the fall guy, I would be the only person the SEC could find. "It's a significant move, Corvin," I said, my voice as steady as a heart rate monitor. "It places the entire structural risk on my shoulders." He finally turned, walking toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's what being a partner is about, Bastien. Carrying the weight so the firm can fly. I've spent 15 years preparing you for this. Consider it your final initiation." I looked down at the signature line. It was the moment they had been building toward for years, the culmination of the curated distraction Lyra had provided and the mentorship Corvin had weaponized. They didn't just want my wife and my money, they wanted my freedom as a safety net for their own. I picked up the fountain pen, the weight of the gold nib familiar in my hand. I could see the fractional relaxation in Corvin's shoulders, the way his ego flared with the satisfaction of having successfully manipulated his predictable protégé one last time. He thought he was watching me sign my confession. I signed the document with a flourish, the ink drying dark and permanent on the page. But as I handed the folder back to him, I wasn't thinking about the liability. I was thinking about the clause I had secretly inserted into the digital master file an hour earlier, a cross-reference that linked these very documents to the Hale and Rowe accounts. By signing this, I wasn't accepting his guilt, I was tethering us together. If I went down, the anchor I had just attached to his neck would ensure he hit the bottom first. "Thank you, Bastien," he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt like lead. "I knew I could count on you." "Always, Corvin," I replied, meeting his gaze. "You taught me everything I know about loyalty." The scotch in my glass remained untouched, the amber liquid reflecting the clinical glow of the overhead recessed lighting. We were back in the present, back in the silence of the penthouse that had once felt like a sanctuary and now felt like a stage. Lyra stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette sharp against the city lights she so desperately craved. She had finally said it. The words had hung in the air for minutes. "I've been in love with Corvin for years." I didn't move. I didn't offer her the dramatic collapse she had clearly rehearsed for. My lack of reaction seemed to agitate her more than a shout would have. She turned toward me, her face a mask of elegant defiance. "Don't look at me with that blank stare, Bastien," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of guilt and newfound arrogance. "I didn't want it to be like this, but Corvin, he's different. He operates on a level you can't even see. When he walks into a room, the air changes. He has a power that is visceral, a hunger that matches my own. He doesn't just manage life, he dictates it." She took a step closer, searching my eyes for a flicker of the man she thought she had outpaced. "And you, Bastien, you're safe. You're the steady hand. The predictable strategist. Every morning at 6 a.m., every evening at 7 p.m. I knew exactly what you would say before you said it. I knew exactly how you would react to every crisis. I was suffocating in the certainty of you. I watched her, noting the way she justified her betrayal as a pursuit of truth and depth. It was a classic narrative of the underestimator, believing that because someone is quiet, they are simple, because someone is consistent, they are shallow. She truly believed she was leaving a boring life for a grand one, unaware that the power she worshipped in Corvin was a house of cards I had already begun to burn. He promised me a world where we don't have to hide, she continued, her voice gaining a feverish edge. A world where his influence and my vision create something legendary. He's a mogul, Bastien. You're just his best employee. I set my glass down on the marble coaster with a soft, final click. I didn't tell her that her legendary world was currently being dismantled by the very man she called predictable. I didn't tell her that Corvin's visceral power was currently being quantified in a federal indictment. I simply looked at her, this woman who had traded 15 years of loyalty for the illusion of a throne, and felt a profound, cold sense of pity. I understand, Lyra, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You chose power over predictability. It's a bold trade. I hope it's worth the price. She froze, her eyes widening at the lack of bile in my tone. She expected a victim. Instead, she found a man who looked like he was watching a closing bell she couldn't hear. The chime of the private elevator echoed through the hallway. The guest I had invited was finally here. The chime of the private elevator was a clean, sharp sound that sliced through the tension of the room. Lyra straightened her posture, a triumphant, expectant light flooding her eyes. She smoothed her silk skirt, her chin tilting upward in anticipation of the man she believed was coming to claim her. She expected Corvin Hale to walk through those mahogany doors, the titan, the mogul, the man who had promised her a life of legendary power. But when the doors slid open, the air didn't change because of Corvin's presence. It changed because of the cold, metallic reality of the law. 3 men and 2 women stepped into the foyer. They weren't wearing the tailored Brioni suits of the financial elite. They were wearing the charcoal wool of federal service. In the lead was Marcus, the whistleblower I had met in those rain-slick diners, flanked by a lead investigator from the SEC and 2 federal agents. Lyra's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. She took a step back, her hand fluttering to her throat as she looked past them, searching for a shadow that wasn't there. Bastien, she whispered, her voice finally losing its practiced elegance. Where is he? Where is Corvin? Corvin is currently being detained at the firm, the lead investigator said, his voice as devoid of emotion as a bank statement. He held up a digital warrant. Mrs. Rowe, we are here to execute a seizure of all digital assets, business ledgers, and physical records related to Lyra Rowe Interiors and Hale and Rowe Holdings. Lyra froze. The visceral power she had worshipped was nowhere to be found. In its place was a terrifying, bureaucratic vacuum. She turned to me, her eyes darting with a frantic, animalistic speed. Bastien, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake. You're the strategist, you can fix this. You know we haven't done anything. I didn't move from my chair. I didn't even put down the scotch I still hadn't tasted. I simply watched her realize that the predictable man had been the one who had invited the storm into our home. I did fix it, Lyra, I said quietly. I spent the last year fixing every leak you and Corvin left in the hull. I just chose to let the water in instead of pumping it out. The agents moved with surgical efficiency, spreading through the penthouse to secure the very files I had already duplicated and handed over months ago. Marcus caught my eye and gave a single, solemn nod. The debt was being paid. Lyra looked at the investigators, then back at me, the realization finally hitting her like a physical blow. The man she had called just an employee was the architect of her ruin. She wasn't being whisked away to a throne, she was being processed into a case file. The silence of the penthouse was no longer the silence of a home, it was the silence of a crime scene. The news cycle in the city moves fast, but the fall of a giant has a way of slowing time down. I sat in a quiet hotel suite across from the financial district, the television muted, watching the silent chaos unfold on the screen. The breaking news banner was a jagged line of crimson: Hale financial founder detained in federal raid. The footage was grainy, captured by a bystander's phone, but the image was unmistakable. Corvin was being led out of the glass and steel lobby of the firm we had built together. He didn't look like a mogul. Without the rehearsed lighting of a boardroom and the shield of his mahogany desk, he looked small. His silver hair was disheveled, and for the first time in 15 years, his eyes weren't scanning the room for vulnerabilities. They were fixed on the pavement, searching for a dignity that had already been liquidated. I picked up my tablet and watched the live market feed. The Hale Empire, ticker symbol, once a beacon of aggressive growth, was in a vertical freefall. It was a beautiful, mathematical slaughter. Within 40 minutes of the arrest, the stock had shed 30% of its value. By noon, the circuit breakers had tripped twice, but there was no stopping the bleeding. The institutional investors were fleeing, the silent partners were scrubbing their names from his ledgers, and the house of cards Lyra had helped decorate was being swept into the street. I felt no surge of adrenaline, only the cold satisfaction of a balanced equation. 6 months ago, I had begun the quiet process of divesting my personal assets from any entity touched by Corvin's corruption. I had moved my interests into boring, stable commodities and blind trusts that Corvin's ego had once mocked as peasants' work. While he and Lyra had been busy inflating their lifestyle with the ghost accounts of Hale and Rowe, I had been building a digital fortress around my own future. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Theodora, the attorney who had helped me navigate the final legal traps. It's done. The freeze on your personal accounts has been lifted. You're clear. I looked back at the television. The reporters were already interviewing former employees, people Corvin had stepped on to climb his ladder. The narrative was shifting. The mentor was now the villain, and the empire was a crime scene. I thought of Lyra, likely sitting in a cold interrogation room, realizing that the power she had traded her soul for was currently being sold for pennies on the dollar. Corvin had taught me that in the market, you don't survive by being the strongest. You survive by being the one who knows when to leave the room. I stood up and closed the laptop. The liquidation was complete. The shadow of the mogul had vanished, and for the first time in my life, the air in the room belonged entirely to me. The new office is small, barely a quarter of the size of Corvin's mahogany cathedral, but the air inside it belongs entirely to me. It sits on the 18th floor of a modest brick building, far enough from the financial district that the light doesn't feel filtered through the ego of other men. There are no floor-to-ceiling glass walls here, no silent observers, and no curated distractions. Just a desk, a laptop, and the quiet hum of a career being rebuilt on a foundation of actual transparency. I spend my mornings watching the fog lift off the river, a cup of coffee steaming beside me. People ask me sometimes if I feel a sense of loss, if I miss the high-stakes adrenaline of the Hale Empire, or the elegance of the life Lyra and I had supposedly shared. I tell them the truth: I didn't lose a life, I settled a debt I didn't know I owed. The distance between the man who sat in that penthouse and the man sitting here now is not measured in miles or net worth. It is measured in the steady rhythm of my own pulse. I think of Lyra occasionally, but the memory has become clinical, like an old audit file. She wanted the visceral power of a mogul, and she found it, only to realize that power without integrity is just a high-speed collision waiting for a witness. Corvin's trial is still months away, but the verdict was reached long ago in the eyes of the market. He is a lesson now, a cautionary tale used by the very people who once clamored for his favor. He taught me everything I know about the architecture of a lie, but he failed to teach me the most important lesson, one I had to learn for myself in the silence of his shadow. I learned that the most effective way to deal with a mogul is to let them believe they've already won. Let them think your silence is submission. Let them believe your predictability is weakness. Because while they are busy taking a victory lap in a world they think they control, you can quietly move the finish line. I stand up and walk to the window. The city is waking up, a complex system of patterns and pulses, but I am no longer looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. I am looking at a horizon that is clear, open, and entirely my own. My life is quiet now. It is real. And as I've learned, in a world built on facades, that is the only true position of power. It's been a long journey from that glass-walled penthouse to this quiet office, and I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the path that brought me here. If there is one thing I've learned from dismantling an empire and rebuilding my life from the wreckage, it's this. The most dangerous people in your life aren't the ones who oppose you, they're the ones who believe they've already figured you out. Corvin and Lyra didn't just betray my trust, they weaponized my consistency. They saw my silence as a lack of awareness and my loyalty as a license to exploit. But what they called predictability was actually my greatest advantage. It gave me the room to observe, the time to document, and the clarity to act when they were too blinded by their own reflection to see the storm coming. The vital lesson I want you to take away from my story is that your value is never defined by how others perceive you. People will try to box you in, call you just an employee or the steady spouse, and use that label to move pieces behind your back. Let them underestimate you. Because while they are busy playing a game based on a version of you that doesn't exist, you can be the architect of a reality they aren't prepared for. Loyalty is a gift, but it should never be a blindfold. Keep your eyes open, watch the patterns, and remember that numbers and people always tell a story if you're patient enough to listen to the math. If you found value in how I navigated this hostile takeover of my own life, I'd love for you to join this community. We explore the deep, often hidden mechanics of betrayal, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your power. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. There are so many more lessons to uncover, and I'm glad to have you here as we navigate them together. Until next time, keep observing. The truth is always there, hidden in the details.